America. Brookings Institution had a report yesterday that moms were reporting that 1 in 5 children in America does not have enough food to eat. We see what's happening at food banks and the rest across the country, and it's really hard to explain to anyone why the Republicans would not support that.
Nancy Pelosi has $100 million in the bank. A video of Nancy Pelosi was put out with her dancing around her kitchen with a bunch of ice cream in front of two $12,000 refrigerators. In California, there are modern-day bread lines with cars lined up for blocks in rows, just looking for the basic sustenance of trying to eat. 50% of the people in Los Angeles have lost their jobs, which, again, with the majority of the country living from paycheck to paycheck, and the majority of the country not having $500 in the bank in case of an emergency, you can imagine that many people are in dire circumstances. Right now, in California, there's a race that has taken place with the Democrat. Despite being in deep blue California, despite having an advantage in the standpoint, from the standpoint of numbers of people who are Democrats versus Republicans in that particular area, the Democrat is set to lose. Hashtag reasons. And I'm going to give you those hashtag reasons. And part of it starts with Nancy Pelosi and the weakness and the fecklessness of Democrats in Congress. Understand for the moment, the Democratic Party has the House of Representatives. And while having the House of Representatives, it has given Republicans 4 bills, stimulus plans, basically of everything that the Republicans wanted, signed and voted on by Nancy Pelosi. This, while simultaneously not providing for the public, not providing credible opposition in order to push back against the Republican demands. And now, after everything is said and done, after she's given Republicans everything that they wanted, now Nancy Pelosi is coming out saying, we're going to come out with a Rooseveltian-style plan. We're going to come out with an FDR-style plan in order to deal with the vagaries and the difficulties of the public, for the American public. The reality of it is she's pushing for something that she knows would never pass because she's already given Republicans everything that they wanted. She doesn't have any leverage. I would argue that the reason why Christie Smith is losing is in part because of the weakness, fecklessness, and basically worthlessness in many respects, especially in dealing with the hard edges of our capitalistic system and the worst outcomes of the COVID-19 crisis. I would argue that in part the reason why Christie is losing this race, if indeed she ends up losing this race, is in part because of Nancy Pelosi and the Democratic Party in the House of Representatives. There are additional reasons, but let's start there. Welcome to our early morning, nap in the bed soapbox. My name is Jamal Thomas. This is the Progressive Soapbox. Guys, if you dig this content, please like, share, subscribe. You can always support this content through PayPal or Patreon. This content is brought to you by you, and I appreciate you for giving me the opportunity to bring it to you. So, when real men can't sleep, real men do the news. So here I am. There's a story that's coming out of California that is fascinating and that is basically indicative of everything that I argue in regards to the consequences for the left backing any random Democrat, and how those consequences are visited upon the party, not just in presidential elections, but also in representatives or senator elections. In this very specific case, there's a special election because Katie Hill was basically sex shamed out of her seat. Now, Christie Smith is an assemblywoman for state office in California. Uyghur, host of TYT. Now, Uyghur and Christie Smith ran in the primary. Between the two, Christie Smith stumped a mud hole and won Cenk Uyghur. It wasn't even close. Christie Smith, who won the primary for the Democratic Party, is now running against Garcia. Now, Mike Garcia is a Republican in this race. This is a race that has taken place in California. California is deep, deep, deep blue. And not just deep blue, the fact that Katie Hill had the seat before shows that there is a propensity and a possibility that a congressman can win that seat. Christie Smith is not for Medicare for all. Christie Smith is a centrist, or you can call it a right-wing Democrat. And that right-wing Democrat is basically losing to the Republican in a blue state in an area that has more Democrats than Republicans. Let's go into why. The why is more interesting. This is Huffington Post. There's no two ways to slice it. We're down right now, Smith's campaign wrote in a fundraising email to supporters on Friday. Republicans are turning in their ballots faster than Democrats. We might just lose a toss-up election. Even though Democrats outnumber Republicans in the district, Republicans have greatly outnumbered Democrats in returning the ballots that were mailed to every voter in the district because of the pandemic. Democrats in both D.C. and California believe that the party will have a better chance of winning the seat in November, when the electorate will be larger and more focused on the president. Meaning they've gotten to the point of saying, all right, we're probably going to lose this one. Let's focus on November. This is an issue of a centrist Democrat basically falling prey to Republican attacks. Despite the fact that Christie Smith is not for Medicare for all, has endorsed Christie Smith. Right here on Twitter. Californians, Christie Smith is on the ballot for tomorrow's special election in the 25th Congressional District. Vote to send Christie to Congress to fight for working families and send a message to Californians to reject Donald Trump's hateful agenda. Again, not for Medicare for all, and Sanders still came out to give her his backing. Why is she losing? Why is she losing? I have a few ideas as to why, and I think it's probably a little bit of all of them. The National Party reflects on local candidates, especially when those candidates cannot necessarily distinguish themselves in overt terms. Meaning, if the candidate wasn't necessarily already defined when they came into the race, then people may lean on their notion of the National Party in order to basically put shape and image to fill out the gaps to what they don't necessarily know. Well, if they're going based on the National Party, then if the National Party is not necessarily distinguishing themselves, then they may have a hard time making that vote, or they may be less interested in making that vote. Meaning, if the National Party is not setting an agenda that interests the public, then the public may not necessarily be interested in voting for a Democrat that is basically going to be a part of the National Party. This other part to this, and I guess my point here is, by not having real opposition from the standpoint of the Democrat, there is nothing to energize and enthuse these people to come out and vote for Christie Smith, as opposed to having somebody who did energize and excite that particular aspect of the electorate. If those people were fired up because of something the candidate was saying, or something the candidate was backing, or something the candidate was doing, they may be that much more likely to vote for Smith, even though this is a side election and another election is going to take place in November. Meaning you may end up drawing attention to the election in and of itself just because of a exciting presidential candidate. By Joe Biden running the presidential election in his basement, in his PJs, you don't get that bump that you would potentially get from an exciting candidate. The other part to this, and I mentioned this before, Nancy Pelosi and the Democrats in Congress. By Nancy Pelosi not really putting up real opposition and doing anything of substance, this person, Christie Smith, doesn't necessarily get any level of bump or any level of recognition from the standpoint of what is a typical Democrat looking at Congress. You say, not much. Meaning Christie Smith is running in adverse conditions because she doesn't necessarily have any support from a party that is doing anything of substance that would actually generate some level of buzz and support for her campaign. The last part of this has to do with centrism. I keep making the point that centrists gut the vote, meaning the people who would typically vote for the Democrats by a person running as a centrist it undermines the vote tally because those people realize that there is no reason, no incentive for them to engage in the political process when they're not necessarily going to get anything out of that political process for engaging in it. The energy that they would expend pushing for some candidate or the other, or donating money to one candidate or the other, for that matter, even caring about the race, is not returned in material gains. So they disengage from the political process. Why do you think year after year after year, the numbers of people who are voting in these presidential elections go down? Well, the same thing applies for candidates. Right here. This is The Intercept. Pew data on this issue is stark. Almost half of non-voters in 2016 presidential election were non-white. Half of non-voters, even though they compose only 1/4 of the voting population. More than half of non-voters, 56%, are poor, making less than $30,000, even though the income group constitutes only 1/4 of the voting population. Again, people making under $30K a year, these would ideally be Democratic voters, and non-white voters make up a disproportionate size of the non-voting bloc. Understand the reasoning of this, though. It's one thing if these people were voting in a process where their vote turned into material gains, either through some kind of expansion of Social Security, some kind of Medicare for all, some kind of elimination of student debt, meaning something that they're doing is reaping material benefits for them and their families that's making their lives easier in significant terms. That's not happening. And because that's not happening, despite the rhetoric that Democratic Party go with, these people get disenchanted and they stop engaging the political process. This woman is a centrist. Katie Hill apparently was further to the left. Her centrism did her no favors. Basically what it boils down to. Centrism in general does not do lefties or the Democratic Party favors because it cuts the vote. It's a continuous race to the bottom where they act like 50% of the population just doesn't exist, as opposed to trying to get the 50% of the population. In this very specific case, Christie Smith may lose this race in a blue state to a Republican, Garcia. And those are my reasonings that she will most likely lose. Like, share, subscribe.